morning, everybody, and welcome to the Data Innovation Summit. My name is Laurence Moroney, and I lead developer advocacy for artificial intelligence and machine learning at Google. And it's my job to really inform and inspire the world at scale around the possibilities with machine learning and AI. So today I'd like to talk about some of the work that we've been doing around widening access to AI to build a developer community. And with this, we believe that by having a critical mass of developers who are skilled with machine learning and artificial intelligence, that we can open the floodgates for the potential for this technology to benefit all of us. And so, I'm just going to dive right into that and some of the research and why we did what we did. So once upon a time, I drew a chart of economic growth in many of the European and North American countries. And it looked a little bit like this. And that dip on the right is a contraction because of the initial waves of the COVID pandemic. So you can probably tell roughly when I drew this diagram, I probably need to update it. But while the overall trend is up, we do miss some important insights when we only focus on that. So what I wanted to do was dig into this a little bit deeper. And instead I drew this, where instead of just each year being a simple plot of the growth amount, I made each year a function of the previous 4 years. How much had it changed relative to the previous 4 years? And as a result, we can begin to see insights on the times and eras of real growth and what was going on during those times. And you can see there are these noticeable plateaus. This one starts in about 1993 and it ends in about 2005. And it's those years of massive growth that came about as a result of the internet. Some of the world's biggest companies came out of this, and before this plateau, the likes of Google or Amazon didn't even exist. And Microsoft and Apple, well, they were just relatively small specialty players in the tech sector. This plateau started around 2007 with the advent of the mobile economy, as many new industries went mobile first and whole new industries were born. But the opportunity with AI and ML is yet to come, and I believe it can dwarf these. And I don't think I'm the only one. For example, the World Economic Forum produced a Jobs of Tomorrow report. And in this report, we see that tech jobs were very clearly at the top, and data and AI were at the top of tech. So expectations were things like product development would grow by 27% over the next few years. People and culture, 18%. Sales and marketing, 30%. But when we start looking at the technology for AI, engineering and cloud computing, a whopping 34%, and data and AI development itself, 37%. We could see that the opportunities are there. The jobs of tomorrow should look like this, but how do we build a skilled workforce to be able to fill them? And not only that, Forbes predicted a compound average growth rate of over 40% in the ML market and AI software revenue. The growth, the potential, it's very, very clear. And the opportunity for everybody to be able to benefit from this is staggering. So why aren't we there yet? What's stopping this from happening? Why is this a future thing? Well, there's a few factors, so let me dig into those and take a look. The first one is to understand the hype. And a quote from one of my favorite authors, Frank Herbert, is, "The first step in avoiding a trap is in knowing its presence." So let's talk a little bit about hype. You've probably seen the classic hype cycle from Gartner, and almost every technological trend follows this cycle. I've simplified it into this chart. AI is here. It's at the beginning. We've passed what's called the technology trigger, but we're still behind this peak of inflated expectations. And a peak of inflated expectations is a general misunderstanding of what a technology is and what it does. But there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of speculation, and the truth about the technology can get lost in all of that. The signal to noise ratio is pretty low. And unfortunately, it's where many technologies go to die. We've probably seen those humorous websites of once upon a time, somebody brought out a device and we thought that device would change the world and it didn't and it failed. Well, that thinking that it would change the world was inflated expectations around it. And when the reality of that device was discovered, maybe people could be productive with it, maybe they couldn't, or maybe that device was just lost behind this peak of inflated expectations and never made it along the curb. Who knows? But where we want to be is here. And it's the spectacularly named trough of disillusionment. And this is where we become disillusioned, not with the technology, but with the hype At least, and those who begin to cut through that hype and see what the nitty-gritty is around that technology, who understand the limitations of it, what it can do, and just as importantly, what it can't do, well, that's the key. That level of understanding. Because when you get that, you can rise up the slope of enlightenment to the plateau of productivity, and you can become productive and start doing real things. Now think about those trends that I showed earlier, those two plateaus. Do you remember when the internet first came on the scene and the hype that was around it? Well, that was a while ago, so maybe not, but think about the mobile one that we showed. Think about that. When that first came on the scene, Steve Jobs did his one more thing and the iPhone was born. And yeah, I know there had been mobile phones before that, but that was really when it took off. That's when the peak of inflated expectations hit. And if you recall, at the time, people were thinking you wouldn't need desktops anymore. You wouldn't need laptops anymore. All you needed was a phone and a docking station. And you could carry your work with you wherever you went. You could get to your office, you could plug the phone in, and off you went. Well, that didn't work like that. That was lost in the peak of inflated expectations. But thankfully, the smartphone didn't go away, and it wasn't lost because once developers did fall into the trough of disillusionment and realized what was possible with a phone and the limitations of a phone, for example, limitations on battery life, limitations on screen size, even like a lot of phones, they had to isolate applications from each other so they don't take each other's resources or eat the battery from the user. All of those type of things became those limitations. But once you saw through those and once you started to see, well, what was possible with a phone, for example, it had GPS sensors on it, whole new classes of applications could be born, whole new industries were born. I always joke that I remember once upon a time, the common wisdom was that you don't talk to strangers on the internet. And whatever you do, you never get into a stranger's car. But now what do? We invoke strangers from the internet to drive up in their car and we get into it and ask them to take us where we want to go. Industry has changed as a result of the mobile phone, but that didn't happen until people fell into the trough of disillusionment and then moved along into productivity. And one little key secret of this one is that those people aren't necessarily smarter than the rest of us. They're just further along the curve. So it's our job, if we really want the technology to succeed, is to drag people along the curve. And that involves, at least in the beginning, putting them into that trough of disillusionment. So the key to that, of course, is to educate the world. And one of the best parts in educating the world, and one of the most important things if you want to be efficient and effective, is to know your audience. So when you explore research into the AI talent pool, you'll see reports like this one, and it's a good one. It dates from about 2020. And it shows that there were about 500,000 total professionals in the AI space. But if you look closely, you'll note that they're specialized. And when you dig deeper, this term AI specialist is defined in surveys like this as usually people who are very highly educated with a PhD or better, as well as those specialist skills that come with AI. Now that's a very narrow set. How do we widen that? Well, we can start by taking a look at software developers. Now, there's lots of surveys out there about just how many there are, but it usually comes down to the current population of developers is in the 20 to 30 million range. But the important thing is that it's growing rapidly. Like this survey found 24.3 million software developers in 2021, but just 7.5 years from now in 2030, they expect 45 million software developers. And when we look a little deeper, we'll see the difference between these developers and the AI specialists from earlier. Well, while those folks are primarily PhD and master's holders, the average software developer does not have a postgraduate degree, with only about 15% of them actually possessing one. Also, when we look at the languages that they like to use and develop with, we found that about 58% of developers use JavaScript and about 42% use Python. So there are tens of millions of developers for each of these languages. The path is then clear. If we can make it easy for the developers who love these languages to succeed with AI and ML, we can start growing the ecosystem of developers greatly. But the first step is to help them understand and how to build ML systems. What's involved in this from end to end, not just one small slice of it, like machine learning, and we want to provide them with the tooling to do that. So all ML systems and anyone will start with data. In fact, most of the code that a developer is going to write will likely reside here. Now, there's a lot that you need to do to ingest data into a system so that it can learn from it. There's formatting and engineering it in the right way for your training code to be able to use it. So a good hosted data service that can export data in a format that can be used for training is essential. And you also need the right way to be able to bring your own data. And of course, this should be open source and easily extensible. You don't want vendor lock-in. You don't want to be charging people a lot of money just to be able to access data, because that's the starting point. And if they can't get beyond that starting point, they'll never go any further. Now, once you have your data, of course, it's time to train the model. Now, a lot of the emphasis in academia and a lot of the emphasis in machine learning is on this part. And this is just one of the 4 parts of the system. So training a model, of course, is very important. And we want the developer to be able to understand training a model in a language that they're familiar with. And that, of course, is code. Now, most of the PhD level stuff and most of the advanced stuff is right here. And it's in understanding how machines learn and the fundamental mathematics behind it. But let's be honest, you don't necessarily need to know how all of that kind of stuff works precisely in order to be able to use it. Like, think about how many developers fundamentally understand how a compiler works. We use compilers all the time. Or how many data scientists understand how the underlying database engine works. But they use them all the time. And indeed, I'm using a laptop right now to give this presentation. I don't understand fundamentally how the chipset of this laptop works and how it's projecting stuff onto the screen. I have a rough idea, but I'm still able to use it. And that same logic should apply. That's the goal. Give developers APIs that encapsulate the different parts of a machine learning ecosystem, allow them to use these off the shelf, but also make sure that they're free and open source. So whenever a developer wants to use it, they can look into it, they can see how it works, and most importantly, they can extend it for their own needs. Now, machine learning is nothing without a place to deploy it. It's all very well to be able to train models, but if you can't get them into the hands of other people, what's the point? Now, the best option that we had was to give developers the facility to deploy anywhere. Now, think about the places where a machine learning model could be used. It could be everything from the scalable cloud to a web server where your users can access it over an HTTP call, to an in-browser where the machine learning inference and the model actually executes with JavaScript within the page of a website using the browser. It can be mobile devices, and I think someday these will be the most common, so Android or iOS phones or tablets being able to run machine learning. And then, of course, there's even embedded systems and microcontrollers, and the sheer volume of these, of course, is staggering. And to be able to make these smarter, I think is very, very important. You've probably seen things like smart doorbells already, but what happens when we can get even smaller and run models on smaller and smaller devices? Again, it's very important to be able to deploy and to be able to use the same set of skills. You don't want to be fragmented where it's one set of skills for one and another set of skills for another. If you can use an ecosystem to train your models and then target those models to your specific deployment, we realize there's a chance for you to really be able to win. And then finally, once the model is deployed, you need all the tools available to have good operations on that model, updating, maintaining, and continuing to use your machine learning system. But we've learned that it's not enough to have all of these openly available to developers. We also need to provide a way for accelerated infrastructure to be freely available. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Machine learning, particularly the second column that you can see here when it comes to training models, is a very computationally intensive task. The CPU on your computer is a general purpose chip designed for everything from managing the keyboard to the network stack to the monitor, you name it. When it comes to machine learning, you need very specialist math that uses generally matrix multiplications and floating point operations. CPU can do these, but it's not optimized for them. By some cosmic coincidence, a GPU, which was a chip originally designed for gaming, it's a graphics processing unit, is a chip designed with lots of little cores, and these specialize in matrix multiplication and floating point operations. As a result, it makes them really, really good for machine learning, and you can greatly accelerate this task, the learning task, using that. And of course, you can be more productive. You can train a model in hours instead of days, minutes instead of hours, that kind of thing. But GPUs can be hard to get, they can be expensive, and particularly recently with crypto mining and the explosion in games and that kind of stuff, that there's a constraint on the supply of GPUs. They can be expensive, they can be hard to get. We wanted to make them freely available to developers. So we ended up creating a service called Google Colab. Google Colab is an in-browser development environment that allows you to train machine learning models and use free GPUs on the back end. So cloud-hosted GPUs by Google are available to you for free so that you can train your models and you can do it in a reasonable amount of time. In addition to that, there's a new type of chip called a TPU, or a tensor processing unit. And this is a chip that's been designed specifically for machine learning. Now again, these can be expensive and hard to find, but in order to widen access, in order to make sure developers have as few barriers as possible to being able to learn how to understand how to build for these systems, we've also made TPU accelerators, 8-core TPU accelerators at the moment, available in the back end, in the cloud for you, using Google Colab for free. So anybody in the world can get access to TPUs, or in the countries where Colab is available, can get access to TPUs, and they can train their machine learning models with them and build up their own skills in them. But of course, we also want to keep responsible and ethical AI top of mind. So across the board, from data to models to deployment to ops, we're providing open source tools and guidelines to help you be responsible with your AI systems. So if you're given a full ecosystem that's free and open source, we think we've opened the gates for developers to succeed with machine learning. But of course, there's one more step, and that's helping them to learn it. To that end, the only true option is to meet developers where they are, to understand them and to work with them to improve their skill set. Now go back to that developer survey I showed you earlier. We saw that 15% of developers have a postgrad degree of some kind. And when we look at how more developers have learned, we see that about 2/3 of them are self-taught. About almost 40% come from some kind of undergraduate course, and there's similar numbers for online courses and on-the-job training. So we said that we should help them with that. So let's start with the self-taught. Now most people go to YouTube nowadays to learn something new. Why should ML be any different? We launched this YouTube channel about 4 years ago, and we now have over 400,000 subscribers. The goal of this channel is short tutorials. We found from research that you lose generally about 50% of your audience within the first 2 minutes of your video. So we wanted to make sure that we've short videos that teach a single concept that inform and inspire developers around something in AI and machine learning. Now maybe we'll thread a bunch of these videos together to make like a short course and that kind of thing. But the idea was to really meet developers where they are, help them with how they learn, understand how they consume YouTube. And in the end, our short tutorials have been viewed and consumed by millions of developers, and the associated code with them has been forked and reused hundreds of thousands of times. The goal, like I said, is to meet developers where they are, and YouTube is one of those places. But one developer in 3 said they learned from online courses. So to that end, we've also partnered with online course providers like Coursera, Deep Learning AI, HarvardX, edX, UDAO, and others to put together a canonical developer-focused set of courses, which have now reached upwards of 2 million developers. They've been immensely successful, and indeed the Coursera ones were cited by the World Economic Forum's Jobs of Tomorrow report that I spoke about earlier as being an essential skill in the jobs of tomorrow. Having MOOCs with free access to world-class training, of course, really works, but our goal, I want to say, was not to make money, but to raise the ability for developers to learn. So we made sure we worked with partners who at the very least offer free auditing content to their courses. And as a result, you don't need a credit card to be able to learn. Anybody can go in and learn the skills. Now, 1/3 also said that they learned from universities, that they've done some kind of undergrad. And we often hear the lag between the skills that you learn at school and those that are used in industry, because industry generally moves faster. So to that end, we took all of the materials, the slides, code, videos, syllabus, everything from the MOOCs, and we've made them available to universities that want to teach AI and ML. Not only did we make it free, we also learned from colleges that creating new classes can often be difficult and expensive. TAs need to be hired, for example, and so to keep in our spirit of widening access, we do offer modest financial gifts to universities to help unblock them so that they can teach. And these funds have been used by schools all around the world to unblock the teaching of AI and ML. And we've used them to fund programs, also to widen access to the traditionally underrepresented, from women's programs in countries where it's hard for women to attend school, to those from minorities around the world. It's been absolutely wonderful seeing how the community is growing in an unprecedented way. But one thing that developers always tell us, that learning is only useful if it leads to career growth. Employers generally find it difficult not just to hire skilled people, but to understand the actual skills and qualifications to fulfill a certain post, particularly when something is so new like AI and machine learning. Now, for example, you probably don't need an advanced researcher with a PhD to build your mobile app that spots birds, but what do you need? So to that end, based on the training syllabi that I mentioned earlier, we put together a rigorous certificate exam to test students on their coding abilities. They'll build computer vision, natural language, and sequence models. And when they pass, they'll get a certificate issued by Google. Now, there are developers all over the world that hold this certificate, and it has been Google's fastest growing certificate program. And for me personally, it's always fun to see when a new developer comes online with a certificate and they're first in their country. But remember, it all starts with an ecosystem that covers everything. And that's what we've been working on for the last few years. And that's what we continue to advance. It's the only way to be sure that we can do something beneficial for everyone, and not just for ourselves or for other corporations. Remember, the entire thing is free and open source, so you can run it on your own infrastructure, you can use ours, you can even use our competitors' ones. We're ecstatic to see that there are millions of developers coming online with skills in AI and machine learning, and it's those people who will build the world of tomorrow. And it's our job and our vision and our goal and our dream and our wish to make sure that it's a good one. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry again I can't be there in person. So I'm Laurence, and please feel free to reach out with any questions, and you can see my Twitter on this slide. Enjoy the rest of the conference.